Welcome everyone to the New Japan Society. Now I say new because you're going to start seeing some changes here over the next few months and next few years. I decided instead of walking up these stairs, I come from the back, just sort of symbolize the changes that you might see over the coming days. Because just as Japan entered a new era, we here at Japan Society are entering a new era. We've got new leadership. We've got a new president in Dr. Joshua Walker, whom I'll introduce in a second. So good evening, everyone. My name's Fred Kantayama. Like one of our esteemed panelists, Gillian, Tett of the Financial Times, I too am a business journalist. I'm also on the board of Japan Society, serving on the programming committee. And as for tonight's program, it's all about global risk, and it's a really good timely topic. There's certainly no shortage of geopolitical risks, whether it's North Korea or Hong Kong or China in the form of the U.S. China trade wars. Oh, here in the U.S., we've got elections coming up, and over in Britain, Brexit. Globally, we've got climate change, not to mention cybersecurity. And just in the few weeks into this new year alone, we were greeted with heightened tensions in the Middle East with Iran and Iraq. And just when we thought that dissipated, wham, last week we get hit with a new coronavirus spreading from China, which, as of now, I think there's now more than 4,500 confirmed cases and 106 dead the last time I checked. And having said that, it sort of raises the question, what sort of financial risk are we facing? I mean, here we are in the late stage of the longest running bull market in Wall Street history, 10 years and counting. What could possibly derail that or even end it? The show that I anchor every day, I just had a guest, an economist, who said, if this coronavirus were to get worse, say become a pandemic, could possibly go against the forces, the tide of globalization, boost protectionism, and possibly shave away from global growth. And that brings to mind what happened to that R word that Wall Street seemed to have swept away for 2020, recession. Does that become a possibility, or what would make that a possibility? And so we're lucky to have some chief risk officers from the financial titans in our community, in the form of Keishi Hotsuki from Morgan Stanley, chief risk officer there, and his company. They've got a U.S. equity strategist who's probably one of the few bears on Wall Street predicting a decline in the S&P 500. And we'll also hear from Quane, chief risk officer at a company that knows all about risk, the giant insurer AIG, who you will recall just a decade ago was deemed so systemically important it was too big to fail. That raises the question, what sort of changes? What have we learned since the last financial crisis that we faced? And I'm sure Gillian and Joshua will be chiming in on all these geopolitical issues. So allow me to introduce tonight's moderator, Joshua Walker. He's a leader from the next generation. He's full of energy and ideas, and he's perfect to moderate this panel and also wear a double hat as a panelist because he hails from the political risk analysis firm Eurasia Group. Under his leadership, by the way, he's bicultural, he's bilingual, he was raised on the northernmost main island of Hokkaido, the son of missionaries, and this guy's a man on the mission. I'm sure under him we'll probably find that he'll take Japan Society boldly where it hasn't been before. But now that we've got Keishi Hotsuki on our board, I'm sure any risks will be calculated, educated risks that are destined for payoff, right? There you go, he's already sweating. At any rate, with that, allow me to introduce our moderator, Joshua Walker, who will then introduce the other panelists on stage. Joshua.
Thank you, Fred. Really appreciate it. I want to thank Fred and his leadership, obviously, on being on the board and just always being so supportive. I appreciate the setting to be able to talk about the new Japan. You have the bios of all of our panelists in front of you. Fred's already told you exactly where they're coming from. So rather than going down the list and spending time, I think we want to jump right into some of the risks. It's been an interesting 2020 already. When we decided to do this panel a month ago, and we're trying to decide, kind of what we were going to talk about and the panelists. I was worried that we might not have enough to talk about. Man, was I wrong. As Fred already mentioned, I hail from Eurasia Group, and they've been putting out a top risks, kind of top 10 risks for the last 20 years. And what's fascinating about that is every year, sometimes, everybody's now doing it. It's kind of like the popular thing to do. Those of you that just got back from Davos know that the World Economic Forum also does this now. It's kind of like a rite of passage now in terms of putting out those. But to have individuals whose entire job is to help navigate and to kind of look through what we at Eurasia Group would call red herrings, things that may seem really big, like North Korea or Iran and those areas, and then what's real? Where should we really be focused? And one of the challenges, I think, when you look at geopolitical risk is also the time horizon we're talking about. How do you look at the macro and the micro and kind of mitigate those different pieces? So I'm looking forward to a great conversation today. So I'm going to dive right in and start with Keishi, who's sitting directly to my left here, who's the Chief Risk Officer of Morgan Stanley and is no stranger to many of you here, having worked at Merrill Lynch before that. Let me just dig right in. How does 2020 compare with other years? How is this year different? It feels somewhat different to some of us, not just because of the decade and obviously in Japan, the Reiwa era, but is there something actually different about 2020 than in other years you've been following the markets and geopolitical risk?
Sure. Before going through some of the views I want to share, I want all of you to understand what's the risk management or chief risk officer does. Our job is to look at the downside and what can go wrong. So clearly from that job, we'll be all biased. So that we look at the world in a negative way and try to make sure that nothing goes wrong and so forth. So the only thing I want to say is if I say economy is great and market is booming, that's a time to sell. Okay? So I'm not going to say that. I think the difference in 2020 is clearly we had a great run of the market in 2019. And if you look at, just look at the S&P 30% increase, and if you look at the average of the past 10 years, roughly, the market, equity markets in the U.S. has managed to go up by around 12%. So clearly 19 was an exceptional year. And the people are already talking about late cycle. And now we had a very strong market, at the beginning of the year. And particularly, when we look at the fundamental of the economy, a lot of economists are actually predicting a lower growth rate, a potential increase on default rates. And if you talk to the rating agency and even my credit people, a lot of people are anticipating more downside this year. But the equity just keep rallying and the credit spreads tighten to the historical low. So there is a little bit of symptom of melting up. And particularly when you notice that all the market indicators, that buying power has strengthened during the fourth quarter of last year. So as a risk manager, I start to feel a little bit nervous about the degree and the fast pace of the market strength, as well as a little bit of complacency in the market, because a lot of investors are still buying, a lot of cash in the market, and particularly if you look at the bond market, they're searching for yield, extra yield. That pressure is very strong. Europeans and Asians are buying U.S. Treasury and American corporate bonds. And I think to some extent, complacency is coming from the fact that people feel comfortable with market stability, and to some extent that they are buying a put from Federal Reserve policy. If something goes bad, the Federal probably rescue the market. So that's a kind of like different dynamics I'm focusing on in 2020. Remember in 2019, at the beginning, it was after 20% correction in the fourth quarter of the 2018. So market dynamics in terms of demand and supply was healthier. And the irony as a chief risk officer is when the market is more volatile, I feel more comfortable because there's a lot of different views in the market and the demand and supply tend to meet each other quite well. And so right now there's just so much buying power in the market, and to some extent that will make me a little bit more nervous.
Interesting, it's counterintuitive. Alyssa Quane, coming to AIG and also thinking about, I want to pick up on something that Keishi said, which was, you both as chief risk officers have been around. You've watched the last decade. Given that we're at the beginning of a new decade, what did we learn from the last decade that looking towards the future either A, should give us comfort or at least areas or indicators that we should be paying attention to? And what did we learn from that?
I think as we kind of started this decade, we were coming off of the crisis, right? The financial crisis generally, and there was a lot of focus on, why did we end up where we did in the crisis? And there was a lot of talk about models and were the models good? Was the information in them good? And there was a ton of focus on, let's get that right. Let's really build the right things. Let's do model validation. Let's do all these things. And I think, a decade on, we're moving beyond that, and we feel, maybe not rightfully so, slightly more comfortable in that space. And I think that over the course of the 10 years, there's been more of a shift towards some of the more technology-related and operational risks that we see in our business, in the businesses of our clients, and therefore some of the risks that we might take on our balance sheet as an insurance company. And I think really thinking about how those things are evolving over time. I mean, at the beginning, a decade ago, the iPhone was a couple years old, right? And now everybody has 2 or 3, right? One for work, one for home. And we're so much more interconnected with one another and with, within our homes, all of the things that are connected. And with that comes a lot of systemic risk, a different type of systemic risk than we may have seen in the financial crisis. And thinking about how that's going to, impact society and then impact your clients, which then impacts you as a company, is something that, as a risk officer and a risk team, we're quite focused on. So I think it's, while we're still, highly focused on the types of things that Keishi talked about as well, I think that's one of the shifts that you see, and that a lot of these things are coming at the risk officers and the companies quite quickly. And how do you sort of switch and adapt and make sure that you're thinking about risks from outside and what the impact might be.
Gillian, you take a different perspective here, given that you're not a chief risk officer, but you write about these topics a lot. And you've just gotten back from Davos, where there was kind of a disconnect, it seemed, between the conversations that were happening on stage versus what at least I was watching in Washington at the time with the impeachment. What do you kind of look at when you think about geopolitical risk and kind of the areas that you're looking towards for 2020 as kind of areas you're interested in tackling, not just from your own personal point of view, but also things that you think we're all going to be paying a lot of attention to, we'll be seeing a lot in the Financial Times. What are those risks, and how do you think about them in comparison to the kind of the chief risk officer perspectives we just got?
Well, when I was listening and trying to frame this into an argument, I thought we're really grappling with what I'd say 3 C's right now. On the one hand, as you say, we live in a world that's become incredibly prone to contagion. We're seeing contagion in terms of medical contagion right now, but it's contagion in terms of financial panic spreading, political ideas, political panic spreading. We're more contagious as a global system now than ever before, I'd argue. But secondly, I think the point that you make is we're also incredibly complacent, because if you look at how markets are behaving right now, it is quite extraordinary how everything is melting up, given that the economic fundamentals are not melting up with them. And there's a very simple explanation for that, which is that if you look at what's happening to financial conditions and global liquidity under the metrics that various branches of the Fed collect, they're at record easy levels right now. It's even easier today in the financial markets than it was in 2006 on the eve of the last crunch. And that's because central banks around the world have been pouring liquidity into the markets at an astonishing pace. And although the Fed's pulled it back a bit recently, the reality is that dozens of central banks cut last year, and essentially you've had this absolute tsunami of liquidity going in, creating these easy financial conditions and this complacency. And that's going hand in hand, the contagion and complacency, with a series of crunch points which are hitting the world right now. And on the one hand, you have a US president who, unlike most US presidents, wants to create a calm world where everything is great. He thrives on instability And he's come to power by deliberately destabilizing people around him, be that inside Washington or the world stage. So you have a president who's addicted to destabilizing whatever he can. You have these major power shifts in the world as economic power shifts away from the West very broadly, the long structural shift towards the East. You've got these big technological shifts that you've touched on in terms of the whole rise of cyberspace, and you have the climate that's created another big crunch point. So it's a very curious cocktail, which makes me very glad that I'm not paid to be a chief risk officer, but just comment on it.
I agree with you.
Contagion, complacency, and crunch points. I mean, how weird is that? And the last point I'd mention in terms of, a very revealing data point was that every year the World Economic Forum at Davos comes out with this study of what they think the biggest risks are. And they do that by polling their members. And they ask them to list the top 5 risks, both in terms of likelihood and in terms of the damage that they'd inflict. And if you went back 15 years, it was all originally before the financial crisis about technology and things. And then after the financial crisis, for years, it was all about economics and finance. That was what the top risks were. Then it became about things like cyber hacking. And then at the middle of this decade, it became things like income inequality and geopolitics. This year, for the first time ever, the most remarkable thing was the top 5 categories in top 5 ranks in both. In fact, the 4 out of 5 in one of them, 5 out of 5 in the other, were all environmental. So Davos delegates have gone from not really caring about the environment that much to being absolutely obsessed with it. And that's partly a function of growing awareness of climate change and how that could basically blow everything up, but also a function of the fact that the other risks are perceived to be receding because of this relative complacency.
Yeah, it was fascinating to watch the juxtaposition between the first Davos with President Trump, where everybody didn't know what to expect, and it was kind of a big spectacle, to this time where you had President Trump and Greta Thunberg in the same room, and not really much fireworks. And the real headline was, instability, we're used to that now, we're predicting that. And the fact that climate has reached that point, it's almost like for all of our lifetime, we always just thought we could take, and never had to really pay the price in terms of the globe. And now it seems that there is a price that we pay in terms of climate and everything else.
The thing about President Trump is fascinating because there was a wonderful study done after the Challenger disaster by a social scientist called the normalcy of deviance, which points out that what tends to happen in any institutional society is that weird things happen, people take risks, but they rarely go from safe to totally dangerous in a single step. They take lots of little tiny risks over and over again, which gradually become normalized. So they push the boundaries, push the boundaries, push the boundaries. And with Trump is a kind of case study in this, in that, he pushes the boundaries constantly, he destabilizes constantly, and it seems shocking at first, and everyone adapts, and then it begins to seem almost normal. So this time around in Davos, everyone kind of went, he said a few rude things on stage, but he kind of stuck to the script. Astonishing.
Yeah. I mean, lowering expectations is a real political skill in many ways. Just as one more data point, Eurasia Group's been putting out these top risks for 20 years. America's never even entered it. For the first time, it was the top risk this year, which I think says a lot. So I guess the question I want to come to Keishi with is, we're sitting here in New York. It's not just the kind of financial capital of the world, it's also the engine or driver of the American economy. This is something that you have to think about a lot in terms of where the U.S. business cycle is, which seems to be moving further into the late phases. I think all of you have talked about. So what are those financial market risks, and kind of how do you respond and think about what we just heard right before your second round?
Well, I think always, from a typical commercial bank, investment bank point of view, try to find, I always say from the, like risk management expert perspective, it's easy to point out the bubble, but it's much harder to find when the bubble will burst. So, back in the mid-2000s, I was working at the Merrill Lynch at that time. I came to the view from the 2005, this is a bubble. I came from Tokyo to New York, and seeing all the real estate price and what kind of things that people were trading, I thought that 2005, it's already a bubble. But as you see on the movies and books and so forth, a lot of hedge funds start to go short real estate market for 2005 or 2006. They lost tons of money by 2008. So the timing is quite important. And all I can say at this point in time is we are cautious and extremely careful about and how much of this liquidity run is continuing, and any symptoms of the stretch in the market, and we are watching like a hawk. And hopefully that we try to manage the risk appropriately, because ultimately, we as a bank, we are in the lending business. We cannot just stop the engine and say, okay, we have a bad market view and stop lending. We are in the business, but clearly that every week and every day that we have a conversation about what's going in the market, who's buying, who's selling, and then try to find out the chemistry or the temperature of the market. That's the best you can do.
Alyssa, you started and talked about kind of the major changes over the last decade and focus on technology. This idea of kind of cybersecurity, which wasn't all that prevalent a decade ago, is now all the rage. It's almost like you can't talk about risk or geopolitical risk without talking about it. Even in the military realm, when you talk about kind of the gray zone now between what a kinetic strike looks like in Iran and eliminating a threat like Qasami there. What does the cyber piece of this looks like, and how do you think about that from an information security point of view? Because you've been so many breaches, so many conversations about our banks and our other institutions trustworthy? Can they be, can they keep our data? There's a whole industry, it seems, that's built up around that. Why is there a need to focus on that now? And then what can we do to mitigate such threats and risk, and how do you think about that in your job?
Yeah, look, I mean, this is, it feels like an ever-present threat, right? And the threat actor is far more advanced and always out in front, and, it's like you can't keep up, right? No matter what security you put in place or what monitoring or scanning you're doing to see who's attacking you, and as you scan, you just see it just keep coming at you. And so I think it's really important for everyone to be vigilant. And we often say, in the kind of risk forum, it's a matter of when, not if, right? And data is a commodity now. And oftentimes, I think in the beginning people used to think, oh, well, I have this kind of data and that's important, but I keep this other stuff and who cares about it? The issue is that data that you thought really wasn't worth anything is probably worth something to someone else for some reason that you don't know, given what I described in sort of the interconnectivity and what it could ultimately be used for. And so I think clearly, as you're looking to protect yourselves and protect your firms, you do need to think about, what is the most important information that you have, and do your best to secure that to the highest extent possible, right? We're risk managers, so you have to sort of risk rate everything because it's very expensive, to do, and you want to be balanced, I think, in terms of what it is that you're doing to protect that information, because you want to be able to say, to customers or clients, and be clear about what steps you're taking, precautions, et cetera, in order to protect that. And so I do think it matters. You've got a lot more focus from individuals themselves who care about their information and what's happening with it, and you also have a lot more regulation that's coming in and looking at that. And with GDPR in Europe, with the California, and each of the individual states is now kind of coming up with their own view on what information should be protected, how, giving people different rights around their own information. And so that becomes much more complicated for financial services or any type of firm that really is collecting information. So I think being, you asked the question sort of, how do you focus on it and how do you protect it? I mean, I think you have to be really thoughtful about the spend that you're doing, and is it enough, and are you spending on the right things? How much time are you spending securing the perimeter, and then how much time are you spending securing, if they do get in, how do you sort of mitigate what it is they can take out, and that sort of thing, or, protect yourselves. I think planning is just really important. As I said, if it is really a matter of when, not if, how are you going to react? Are you prepared? Have you practiced? Do you know what are the types of questions you need to be asking? Do you know who do you need to have on call to give you good advice on how to handle the situation as well? And I think that my concern is that people get more and more immune to these things because there's so many breaches that you read about in the press. Some are very minor, and so you don't hear about them at all. Others are quite major. And to your point, people can kind of get complacent, right? Because it becomes it seems like normal. But when it will happen to you, you're the ones that have to really manage it and react and, protect your reputation from there.
So, Gillian, you gave us kind of these moments in time using the Davos kind of CEO barometer there, and talked about, climate is kind of shockingly like the very top thing right now. It's very top of mind for everyone, cybersecurity being before that, and economics being the main driver there. When you think about kind of the broad strokes of history, and you think about the Cold War, and think about what that taught us in one way or another, it seems to me that something different is going on here. The U.S. and China are not these two separate entities that we can live separately. Our economies are fully intertwined. And what seems to be happening now is this kind of great decoupling, as some have called it, of kind of in a technology sphere, the American-led technology world and the Chinese-led technology world. What does that mean, and is that a fair assessment to think about kind of the risk coming forward? Is it really just a story of kind of U.S. companies versus the Chinese state? How do you think about these broad trends, and are there lessons from the past that maybe are useful to think about, or actually sometimes it's not useful to prepare for the last war when things are changing from a technological point of view so quickly?
Well, I think the thing that's fascinating right now is that Graham Allison, the professor at Harvard, came out with a book, The Thucydides Trap, which I can barely pronounce because I have a lisp. But a few years ago, made the point that if you look back through the sweep of history, there are very few occasions where a dominant power has been challenged by a fast-rising power that have not ended up with war. And there have been a few, but very few. And in that context, what's been happening in the U.S. China relationship is deeply troubling, because China has amassed power and economic might at a startling speed and is definitely challenging the U.S. Simply by virtue of its presence. What has changed it, arguably this time round, and made it even more interesting and potentially more dangerous, is that there are very few times when you've had this dynamic of a fast-rising country going up against a dominant power, where the two economies have been so deeply entwined and essentially depend on each other in a new technology, because the tech ecosystems have been deeply entwined for many years, along with the supply chains and everything else. So you have the weight of history and politics clashing with economic reality and necessity, and that's where we are right now. Ripping apart the two tech ecosystems would be pretty, if not devastating, but damaging for the global economy. It's something that nobody was factoring into their models of the future until very recently. But it wouldn't just be a case of the supply chains being disrupted. You could end up with a so-called splinter net. And bear in mind, almost every prediction of the economic future in the last decade has been predicated on this idea that we had a common internet around the world that linked us all together. If you had a splinter net, two rival internets, that could change a lot of the projections. But of course, you also have this, cyber hacking. You have tensions around Taiwan because, in many ways, Taiwan now is ground zero of the tech ecosystem wars. The chip infrastructure is, highly prized and going to be fought over at some point. So it's potentially very destabilizing going forward. The good news is both sides seem to recognize that, and while they're both trying to build independence, they're also trying to step back from fully fledged rivalry and something nastier than, simply a trade war. And simply a trade war sounds almost cute, but the good news is that these rivalries thus far have been primarily about, trade. And they've been solved by a shopping list of soybeans. I mean, who would have guessed soybeans are so interesting? Suddenly, soybeans are this major geopolitical tool. But, the question really is, do we go from a trade war and fighting about how many tons of flipping soybeans they have to a much more serious, currency war, capital war, a cyber war, and then a real war? Those are the different levels. And let us all hope it stops with a trade war and is resolved with soybeans.
With that optimistic thought, Keishi, I have to come to you and ask you about kind of in your job and just even personally even, what keeps you up at night? What are you worried about? Every presidential candidate is kind of like, what's that 3 a.m. phone call? And we've had candidates come up with different answers that were made fun of at the time that have been proven later on. If you're a chief risk officer and you're sitting there with your boss and he comes back from Davos and says, okay, here are the 5 top things that I learned about, climate's the big risk. How do you actually think about that, and what really worries you?
Yeah, so the answer to your original question, that what makes me keep at night, is one of the frequently asked questions for the CRO, and my answer is my wife. Because I snore, and then she yell at me. It's like, I cannot sleep because of your snoring. Just go to the other room. That's what makes me keep at night.
Okay.
Next.
No. So there's no worry really in terms of besides your wife sleeping.
You are talking about worry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Look, I think I absolutely agree with Gillian that what I'm not worried about is that if, let's say, coronavirus has caused a certain market jittery and I have a 10% correction in equity, I actually feel a little bit better about the healthiness of the market. But if the liquidity situation just keep going, and then another market correction and all the central banks, ease the financial condition, I think that's worse for the long term in the market. So that's the dynamics in the market I worry about. If we have too much of liquidity in the market and the complacency or incentive for the clients or the investors become distorted. I used to be a trader in the 80s and 90s. Equity volatility was 20 to 25%. Interest rate used to move 25 to 50 basis points in a day. And now we are talking about a few basis points, and we are talking about 12% of the volatility in equity. Some of the clients don't feel the risk of the equity markets anymore. And that's how complacency is becoming a little bit of danger. So I think healthy dynamics of volatility is good, and if you have too much of the liquidity in the market, and eventually the market situation will become much, much worse. You cannot just continue like that forever.
So I've learned my lesson, Alyssa. I'm not going to ask you kind of what keeps you up at night because I don't
Nothing. I'm so tired.
You're so tired, you're passing out.
Oh
But
God.
the same question to you. What are you most worried about in terms of when you look out there and the broad scope of a new year, a new decade? What worries you, and what are the areas that you say, well, I really wish people would pay more attention to these areas?
Look, what worries me about, doing a good job is, of all the balls you're keeping in the air, a few of them always fall on the ground and you hope it's not a really big ball, right? And as the things are flying at you and the different risks are changing out there, are you catching the right ones and making the right decision around this is something we should really focus on or move on? One of the things that, and I don't think it's an immediate, I think it's more of sort of a medium term, is around this whole concept and the impact around the climate change. And there's risk associated with it with regard to the planet, with regard to, things that we would have to live with on a day-to-day basis. But I think it's also, in the fact that, everybody's saying, and it is their top 5, it's not like number 1 of top 5, right, that it's coming out that many ways. There's a little bit of concern for me around the chaos around it, shall we say, right? And, the call for an industry, right? People who invest a lot or whatever to be making the moral call on what needs to happen, et cetera, versus, do we have the right policies, public policies out there around this, et cetera, to really deal with it holistically? Because it's not one industry's problem, right? It's going to be everyone's problem. And I think when you don't have some form of structure, if you will, for lack of a better word, around it, that people end up being reactive to everything that's getting thrown at them. The last person's, request for something, or the pressure from over here, without then being able to step back and sort of really take it in and say, what are all of the various impacts that will occur as a result of that? What's the risk associated with it? And how, what are the multiple means to address it? And which will make the most sense in the short term, in the medium term, and then for the longer term. So I think, not sure the right way to say it, but we kind of got to get our act together, right? So sort of generally around that, and how we're going to try to impact change in that space. But I think it takes more than one industry. It takes more than just the people who are investing the money. It takes more than just transition in simply a fossil fuel, sector, et cetera. So.
I'll add to that and say, about 6 months ago, we at the Financial Times created something called Moral Money, which is a platform, a newsletter and a platform and a web page looking at green finance and sustainability and things like that. And there's voracious demand from readers to get information about this because of fear. It's now become a risk management issue. Things like green finance used to be seen as a crusading cause, and now it's become really a risk management issue. And what's very interesting is that Mark Carney, the central bank governor in England, who's a man who spent his entire career essentially analyzing financial flows and economics and GDP numbers and things like that, he now talks about a potentially looming climate change Minsky moment. And by that what he means is that, the world's been very complacent and shut its eyes to the risk for a long time. There's a good chance that at some point either governments or regulators will step in and dramatically mandate things, or more to the point, there'll be some kind of chaotic industry response, and investors will suddenly panic, and you'll get market prices and asset prices swinging dramatically in response. That's a kind of Minsky moment, which is normally used in relation to finance. And I think that's entirely possible. I've just come before this event with meeting a big, massive asset manager who is seriously now concerned about, that's, if not Minsky moment, then basically capital flows suddenly changing course quite radically, and suddenly people saying, we're not going to touch oil and gas companies. What will happen to them? So that kind of shock could come down the tracks. And what's interesting about that from a risk management perspective is that you can't model that into your future-looking models, because models are built on the basis of backward-looking data. And when you have a big structural shift or dislocation like this, you don't really know how to price it. Is that fair? I'm not the risk officer. You're the experts.
Yeah, but I think I'll comment on that one. These are the cases that we don't necessarily build a model, and we clearly learned a lot of lessons, and we don't think everything is modelable. So that's a scenario analysis we do. And I agree with you that we try to analyze the physical risk versus transitional risk. And the transitional risk is that one day people wake up and say there's a huge carbon tax, and then market disruption is big.
Yep.
Then what happens to this business and that business and this lending exposures and so forth? That analysis is as important as a direct physical risk, such as, okay, we have a residential mortgage in California in the flat zone kind of thing. So both of that, the climate risk analysis is becoming extremely important.
So Gillian, let me ask you about, you raised it, and it's, when you say the word 2020, besides thinking about the Olympics, which all of us at Japan Society are excited about, obviously, the thing that most people in the world are very focused on and are covering every day is the U.S. presidential election. And you've already made the case that perhaps that's already been factored in, that because it's become so normal and so outrageous in Washington, you kind of turn off the reality TV show at a certain point in time. I mean, certainly I can feel a difference having just moved from D.C. to New York. In D.C., you cannot escape it. It is, we don't have very good sports teams except for the Nats and the Caps that have won recently. We don't have a good football team. So our sport is basically politics, right? Whereas in New York, it seems that there is a different feeling where, yeah, there's a lot of craziness, but at the end of the day, we want to focus on Wall Street and kind of finance. Do you agree that this is a big risk, the presidential election, or by your comment earlier about having factored in the kind of the crazy, that we're kind of, it's not as crazy as we once might have thought it was?
Well, there's been an extraordinary journey, a psychological journey in the mind of business and finance, because before 2016, nobody was seriously expecting Brexit in the mainstream, nor were they expecting Donald Trump. And so the fact he came in was seen as this huge, great shock, and a chance, essentially a black swan event, or whatever image you want to use. And populism was seen as this great big risk and terrifying. And until quite recently, many of the people I speak to were very much regarding the chance of a second term of Donald Trump as potentially unleashing new risks, simply because they thought, well, once he's got a second term, he's got nothing to lose. He'll go even more crazy and will thrive off even more destabilization than before. I'm not sure that's correct necessarily, because actually he may not feel he has to, be destabilizing in order to keep his position. He may be more concerned on trying to have some kind of legacy, potentially. I just don't know. I mean, I've met Donald Trump. I've been in the White House a number of times. I wouldn't dare predict what's going to happen next. But what's very interesting was in Davos last week, when I was talking to the CEOs, a number of them now consider a bigger risk that they're really concerned about, essentially having American version of Jeremy Corbyn, i.e. a sudden Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren coming into the White House and changing policy course dramatically. And by that, they're worried about sudden, shift in taxation policies, all kinds of anti-business policies coming in, climate change mitigation policies being accelerated, et cetera, et cetera. So in the eyes of much of Wall Street now, that's in some ways a bigger risk. I can see you're nodding, but that's the one they were concerned about.
Yep.
Policy destabilization, uncertainty.
Yeah. I mean, what's fascinating is in this conversation, what I really appreciate, if this was a conversation in Washington, we would have pretty much not been able to get off of the 2020 elections. We couldn't have, no matter what you did, it would come back in some way, because people are so emotionally scarred by this. And I think, you made a good point. It's almost impossible to predict, right? We're sitting here a week before the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary, and honestly, unlike last time around, we don't actually know who the Democratic challenger is going to be, and is it going to be one of the moderates, or is it going to be one of the more left-wing socialist candidates that scare CEO types? And I think what's fascinating is when you think about what that does to the rest of the world, and I think you did a great job of framing this by saying, look, I think oftentimes Americans in particular are guilty of this. We think that we're such an exceptional case that everything else doesn't matter. It's only about us. But actually, Brexit preceded us. The vote in Colombia preceded us. What's going on in the world seems to be, to use one of your C's, the contagion that you talked about, and this populist explosion in democracies. And what's fascinating about that is to say, in our conversation thus far, we haven't really brought up regime type or about populism versus authoritarian and different pieces. What's fascinating about populism, of course, is that every nationalist thinks they're unique. You can't say nationalists of the world unite. That doesn't really work very well because the British ones and the American ones have their own, although, I guess Nigel Farage.
They're trying it in Europe, and people like Steve Bannon have been very active, as he's told me many times, and been very active in going over to Europe and working with what they would regard as a populist forces and trying to make sure that there is an anti-establishment movement in as many countries as possible.
Yeah, I think that's right.
One of the things that's interesting is that one of the countries that's been relatively immune from populism so far has been Japan, and that makes Japan quite an outlier on the world stage right now.
Yeah. So you went
In the
exactly
Western world.
you went exactly where I was going to go next. We're at the Japan Society, so I really have to give you what you want, which is to ask the Japan questions, right? But I want to ask them in a little bit different way, and I think Gillian's already set this up beautifully in terms of saying, look, the world around us has dramatically changed. The one island, it seems, that is not being affected is Japan. Now, we could have a discussion of why that is. You could point to the shrinking population. You could point to the homogeneity of the population. You could point to the lack of a military force adventuring around the world. There's a lot of reasons that we can have a conversation about it. But I think, generally speaking, what we saw earlier, which was kind of rotating prime ministers and a pretty boring political scene, is now being rewarded. Like, boring is good in this world right now. Like, boring is something we like. Being dynamic is, we're a little too dynamic in Washington these days. We're a little too much of that.
I don't like boring.
Yeah. So let me ask you that question. So starting with Japan, how does Japan look to you in 2020, both from the market perspective, but just broadly geopolitically?
So this is a Morgan Stanley research view as well as my view. When you look at the equity values in Japanese market, it's cheap. And we have been saying that from last year from the Morgan Stanley research, and fundamental value-wise, Japan has a good value. But it seems that a lot of global investors hesitate because there is a kind of mental entry barrier that you need to study Japan very well to try to make money. So just simply looking at the valuation ratios and all the statistics and say, let's buy Japan, just doesn't work. And a part of the expectation from the global investors is that how much of the corporate governance changing the cross-share holdings, how much of the actual ROE enhancement they can actually deliver. And so the real governance and the leadership from management going to the board about how to actually extract the better value. And that change is relatively slow. So if you look at the statistics around the progress they are making on reducing cross-share holding, or the size of investment coming from foreign investors, for the last 5 years, it has been quite stagnant. So with a high expectation, and we spend a lot of time in Japan because we have a great partner, MUFG, working together in the joint venture. I'm the board member of the joint venture in Japan. We spend a lot of time on Japan strategy. And when the Abenomics start to happen, we had this huge excitement to say, finally, it's going to change. And there's a lot of fireworks happen. And then in the past 3 years, it's kind of died down, and it's very slow. And that if that momentum changes, there's a lot of foreign investors who are interested in Japan.
So, Alyssa, coming to you, when you look at Japan, what do you see, particularly from the insurance market point of view? Obviously, AIG as a big player there as well.
Yeah.
How does it look to you?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think, in particular over the last 2 years with the amount of natural catastrophes that Japan has experienced with the various typhoons and smaller earthquakes, that I think this is a real question for the insurance market and the insurance industry. And I think that there's, a lot of the support for the exposure in Japan also ultimately comes in through the reinsurance industry. That's more global in nature. So I think there's a question around, is this the new norm as a result of some of the climate change? I think that firms and the industry in total are relooking at their models and taking a look at are there adjustments that need to be made in order to better price the risk, to understand the aggregations of the risks, et cetera. And I think for the industry and thus for the regulators and the government as well, insurance is about sharing the risk. So if there is a step change, if there is, right, with regard to the amount of risk that's there, then there will need to be a conversation around, is that really going to be absorbed by the insurance industry? Does there need to be, new capital coming in? Do we need to think about the way in which the risk is shared. So, i.e., if you're in the U.S., right, you have a homeowner's policy, you have a deductible on it. That's less common in Japan, but that's your element of the risk that you're taking in order to live in that certain area, depending where you live, et cetera. And that might be something that needs to be thought through and could become a bit of a shift within the marketplace there. So I think that that's one of the probably the biggest thing on the minds with regard to the insurance industry, just given the events of the last 2 years.
I find this fascinating because I say, having lived in Japan for a while, I've always been very impressed. I think one of Japan's greatest strengths is this strong cultural tradition of sharing the pain. Mm-hmm. And I was very struck, no, I mean it, I was very struck during the Japanese financial crisis. I remember a CEO once telling me that when a shock hit a Japanese company, essentially what would usually happen was the CEO would cut their salary and try and keep paying everyone the same, or reduce the salary equally across the board and keep everyone on. In the UK, what would more likely happen is they'd sack 20% of the workforce. And in America, the CEO would pay themselves 20% more and sack half the workforce.
I like the American way.
But there's a capacity for sharing pain and knowing that there's a resource constraint, and therefore if a shock hits, the pain has to be shared out. It has been one of Japan's greatest strengths in every sense. And it's one of the things why I suspect that if they ever have to really tackle their enormous debt burden, that will also be shared in the form of some kind of financial repression. But on the issue of the environment, I mean, for me, there are two big issues. One is this environmental issue, and the Tokyo Olympics are going to be such an interesting symbolic moment because Prime Minister Abe has said he wants this to be the ultra-green Olympics, the ultimate ESG-friendly, SDG-friendly Olympics. METI has issued orders to just about every company telling them to get on board with SDG and ESG principles as fast as they can. And yet, the Olympics could actually end up being a terrible symbol of climate change because Tokyo may end up being so hot. They can't actually have half the Olympics. They're having to move things to Sapporo and elsewhere. Yeah. And it could get worse and worse. And we saw that with the Rugby World Cup, mm-hmm. is that we had this terribly, devastating shock during the Rugby World Cup. And for me, it raises really big questions about, what is Japan going to do about energy? Is it going to embrace more nuclear energy or not? What are they going to do about, as you say, risk sharing, flood protection? All of those questions are huge. And on top of that, the biggest risk of all in Japan right now is its location. And the fact that if there is a real rupture between the U.S. and China, that leaves Japan in an ever worse situation, unfortunately. But against all that, as I say, Japan showed extraordinary capacity to absorb shocks and to spread out the pain equally. And frankly, it has a lot of lessons it could share more widely on the world stage. And in Japan, in Davos last week, I was chatting to one of the very few outspoken Japanese CEOs who pointed out that there were more Japanese CEOs at this year's Davos than ever before, apparently. But I didn't know that because they were almost completely invisible. And they almost never spoke out at meetings. And there were very few Japanese big leaders who were sharing their views about this kind of risk mitigation to the rest of the world. And I would argue that given Japan's track record, that is a tragedy.
To pick up right where you left off, obviously as a Dosanko from Sapporo, I'm kind of happy about the marathon being moved up there. I know that Governor Koike is not going to be very happy when she comes through town. But I think to take your point and run with it, Gillian, I think what's fascinating to your point is exactly that, which is when you think about the Tokyo Olympics and kind of the stated 3 goals, which talk about nature, harmony, sustainability, that Nomura Mansai and the guys who are focused on the opening ceremony and the closing ceremony are thinking about, it's a real opportunity for Japan to kind of really promote that concept in the best form. But as you say, the irony, of course, is it could actually, by all the best definitions, still end up kind of highlighting the moment of time we live in. And so I want to ask you, to kind of highlight on the political side, because you already made this reference about Japan's location of being between its security ally that kind of has always been the protector of Japan against China ever since the end of World War II, the U.S.-Japan alliance, obviously, but also its largest economic partner, China, where we're about to have a state visit from Xi Jinping. And when I talk to Japanese officials, they say they've never had better relations with China, never had better relations with the U.S. That can't last, can it? If something changes and the bromance between Trump and Abe is broken apart because of politics in one country or the other, is there a structural argument to be made that this is either A, going to continue indefinitely, or this is being held together kind of helter-skelter by these two leaders that are trying to cling to each other?
Well, I think that Prime Minister Abe deserves extraordinary credit for having danced through this, minefield so deftly thus far, and to have forged a, working relationship with Donald Trump is an incredible achievement. And what's even more of an achievement is to have forged a working relationship with Donald Trump that kind of works so well that no one even talks about it. That's even more of an achievement. And to have done that and maintained, it may not necessarily be the best relations with China, but at least managed to keep them on an even keel without regular fireworks and drama, again, is a remarkable achievement. So let's hope that lasts, is all I can say, because it's certainly not easy to pull off.
I mean, one of the things I hear often from my friends in
I'm
Japan.
paid basically on the panel to say things that these guys can't.
That's why we have a journalist, right? To be able to get
Exactly.
those pieces out there,
Yeah.
try to not get us in trouble, but keep it interesting at the same time. So I am going to be coming to the audience for your questions, so start percolating, start thinking. We've got a great international audience here, but I'm going to do one more round before turning to you all. And the point I want to make is, oftentimes when you think about Japan, sometimes you have it in the way we just had it, which is kind of you ask Japan at the end. But I want to kind of flip that on its head, because I actually think that the Japan that we're now experiencing in the Reiwa era of beautiful harmony is a Japan that knows that it has to globalize. It doesn't have a choice of closing itself off in the way that in the past Japanese were so famous as an island nation. Japan really does have to think globally. You don't have to really think that much more than things like the Indo-Pacific that the U.S. has adopted as their strategy. And of course, Japanese would never promote it as their own, but it certainly was from there. But the concepts that you see, and when you go to Tokyo, the excitement, the energy is sometimes even better than what I certainly experience in Washington, because we are so focused on our own internal problems right now in this country, it's hard to look beyond ourselves. And I think by its very definition, Japan is forced to think about it because of its position. And so when we think about the areas of the world and kind of the areas that we have not talked about tonight, I'm going to ask each of you to respond to kind of, given that the title is kind of what lies ahead. What lies ahead from your perspective that we haven't talked about? I'll start to model this. I think we've talked a lot about climate change and what it means in kind of the calculations and the kind of the way that companies want to be seen as leaders. A lot of the announcements about carbon zero. Microsoft had a big announcement at Davos and everything else. Everybody's trying to get on the bandwagon, and as you pointed out, Gillian, the SDGs are all the rage in Japan in particular. I can't see a single Japanese without one of these pens that has the SDGs on it. And given that we're right across from the UN, it is really a tribute that this organization has been able to come up with something that, at least from a branding point of view, puts everybody on the same side, even if the United States and this administration may not be on board and it is kind of the one outlier that's pulled out of Paris. You see New York City, New York State, California, others jumping into that breach. So from my perspective, when you see the fires in Australia, when you see the typhoons and these major kind of climate issues, it's becoming real to all of us. And clearly, the Japanese propensity and ability to be resilient, right? I always like to use the analogy that in Japan, you don't really think about big oak trees as being strong. It's the tiny bamboo, because of its flexibility and the kind of feeling in Japan that, okay, if you get knocked back down, that's kind of expected. It's cycles, and whether it's boom and bust cycles on the economic side or whether it's kind of geopolitical recession, we all go through it. How do we get up from that? Whereas the American side sometimes is if we have our back broken by a major depression or by a major war or something along these lines, it is not as easy to bounce back. And if we are no longer the number one country in the world by whatever measure you want to use in the next decade, and China enters there, will the Americans be able to be as graceful in that kind of decline as we've seen from our Japanese counterparts? So to me, that's a real lesson.
Short answer is no.
So yes, exactly. It's good that you can say that. I don't have to say it myself as an American, which is embarrassing. But to me, that the question about how that fills us here and the work we do at the Japan Society, thinking about bridging U.S. and Japan for a new era, as Fred talked about, is particularly important and top of mind. And to me, all the conversations we've had about the geopolitical risk makes me even more excited, because in some ways, those challenges are even bigger than we've ever seen before. So it is something that I think about what lies ahead. But having said that, let me just go down the line and ask you kind of what lies ahead. What do you think about in terms of lying ahead?
On Japan specifically.
Japan or globally?
Well, let me talk about Japan. So when I go back to Japan, and I've been living here for more than 15 years, and so I'm kind of half Japanese and half American I'm becoming. I have like all this identity crisis. But then I look at some of the like funny Japanese movie, like many of you know the movie called Fly Me to Saitama. This is a movie about hypothetical Tokyo. And think about this in the New York equivalent. New York hates New Jersey, and then Manhattan decide to put the condition, or you have to get the visa to come into Manhattan. And so you describe the New Jersey get upset, and so New Jersey decide to team up with the Queens and Bronx, and then try to fight the war with Manhattan. I mean, that's basically the story of the movie. I love the movie, and in that moment, I just become Japanese. And the point of the story, that there's a lot of great things I admire about Japan. The culture, the work ethic, education, all the qualities that we are talking about. But when I work for American firms for so many years, they just lack the dynamic nature, and it really lacks the pursuit for the greatness based on the certain incentive. So it's structural. And if somehow that, you mentioned about global as well. The Japan has certain challenge around the aging, and they don't make a lot of changes around the, how to bring the foreigners and how to create the incentives to have more children and so forth. I used to live in Australia in the late 90s. And Australia clearly declared that this is a crisis and they need to change their identity to become more Asian. And they have brought a lot of immigrants and really transformed the country. So I think Japan can still do a lot of things to change the course, but it's very slow. So, that's something I really want to expect, for the government and the industry to try to, make a change. Going back to the equity market, that will have a huge impact. And one way or the other, working the Morgan Stanley and the Japan Society Board and so forth, if I can be part of the help, then would be great.
Absolutely. Alyssa, what lies ahead?
Well, I'll be short and sweet. I think what lies ahead is that 2 years from now, I'm not going to be managing the same risk that I have to manage today, because I feel like there will be something. It may just be a metamorphosis of some of the issues that we deal with today, but there's going to be something new that's out there on the horizon that we're not even really contemplating right now, or we're looking at it and saying, I don't think that's going to be anything, and it's going to turn into something that we're really going to have to focus on. And I don't know what that thing is, but I think just given, with my actuarial nature of looking backward to look forward, that seems to be sort of the trend, that things will continue to move, and we're going to have to continue to have our eyes open and to be thinking about what the implications of different situations could be, and then manage those accordingly.
Gillian?
Well, the things that I sort of think about, worry about, include, rupture in the tech systems between U.S. and China, an acceleration of hostilities there. I think the liquidity situation in the markets is a constant mystery. and I strongly agree with Keishi that, it just looks too good to be true right now. And what concerns me is that if things started to seriously unravel in the markets, we don't really quite understand how they're working these days because of the rise of all the computerized trading. And that, I suspect that could destabilize and create some nasty dislocations quite quickly. If something happened to puncture the current economic run, I suspect we'll see a lot more left-wing populism. We've seen a lot of right-wing populism benefit so far. I suspect that left-wing populism could be next. But immigration, I think that as climate change bites, we're going to see more and more immigration that's going to fuel more and more tensions, particularly if you're living in Europe these days. But I guess in the short term, the issue that I've been worried about for a long time has been both antibiotic resistance and pandemics. It looks as if we don't yet know how bad the coronavirus is. But what it has shown is this issue I started with about contagion, incredible complacency about the contagion, and the fact we have all these crunch points. And it's going to be a very interesting test case to see whether they can seal it, contain it, control it fast enough. But we don't have a world where we have a remotely rational system for developing vaccines or medicines in the West. And unfortunately, viruses and all kinds of pandemics can spread much faster than the current national governments can act to stop it.
So before I come to you, I just want to basically make sure I thank not just our speakers, and we'll do that at the end, but also thank our sponsors who make all this possible. I want to say Citi, Deloitte, Mizuho Financial Group, Toyota Motors, and United Airlines, and obviously the groups that are represented here. What questions do you have? What areas would you like to press? I will warn you in advance, given that I grew up in Japan, the way in Japan this kind of works as a professor is, if you make eye contact with me, that gives me permission to ask you to kind of ask a question, because it's very rude in Japan to raise your hand forcefully. But I'm giving you permission to please ask questions and engage. You guys are here because you care about these issues. You think about this. What areas would you like to ask our panelists? And because we are recording this, if you can at least tell us your name, where you're coming from, and then make sure there's a question mark at the end of your sentence so that we can have a question and not simply a statement. And if I have to do the DC thing of kind of timing you, I will. I forewarn you. So if you'll raise your hand, I see a gentleman right over here. We have microphones that are coming. So I see one over here. I want to make sure some women get some questions too. I see all men with hands up right now. And the gentleman over here as well.
There's a woman over there.
All right, come up here. Yep. So we'll start over here. What I'm going to suggest is let's take two at a time, given that we have two mics, so we can kind of be efficient and get as many of your questions as possible. So let's start over here with this gentleman. Please identify yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, distinguished panelists, for your insights. My name is Ife Induka from Morgan Stanley. My question specifically takes a cue from Gillian's comment on Contagion. So, Japanification, the risk of Japanification. What are your thoughts about the potential impact to global financial markets by the convergence of the elements of Japanification, such as near zero rates, deflation or persistent low inflation, and of course, negative interest rates?
Okay,
Thanks.
So right over here to this gentleman.
My question is more for Keishi. You mentioned several times that you felt the lack of volatility in the market was concerning you. If we understand volatility as manifestation of information entering the market, given how quickly information enters the market now and how we've apparently become non-reactive to massive geopolitical events, could the lack of volatility be the new normal? And by extension, could this bull run continue indefinitely?
I think the first question might have been directed at Gillian, if you want to take a shot at that, Japanification and kind of the risk there, and then the second one for you, Keishi.
I think Japanification is a very real risk because we have a situation where oodles of liquidity being put into the market. You do have an aging population in much of the West, which may be suppressing demand. The oodles of liquidity have been keeping plenty of zombies alive for probably far too long. And most importantly, everyone's kind of got used to it. I mean, the most extraordinary thing that's happened these days is that, everyone thinks that, going around Davos last week, that, zero, low interest rates, negative rates are going to be there almost indefinitely. Paul Volcker died at the end of last year, And I knew him pretty well and went to his funeral. And I was sitting there in the funeral, I suddenly thought, we've really entered, the post-Volcker era. And I initially thought that because attitudes towards government and government service have changed so much in the West, but also because, Volcker symbolized an age where everyone took it for granted that inflation was a monster and needed to be slayed, and were then wrong-footed when it suddenly crumbled in the early years of this century. And we're now entering a world where everyone assumes that inflation is dead, where rates will be low forever, and, it's basically a lack of attention paid to it now. And that's sort of the other side of Japanification, and I think we actually are heading that way in the West right now.
Yeah, I think the answer is when we talk about volatilities, depend on which market volatility we are talking about and why the volatility is low. So the simple answer is I would never buy the argument that there is a new normal for equity volatility being so low, because last time I checked, equity value is determined by discounting all the future cash flows. And by definition, that would be volatile where the economic condition changes. So I would never buy the argument equity volatility would be sustainably low, versus if you look at like a foreign exchange market, that has been extremely low volatility. Why? Because the international coordination around the monetary policy, around the zero interest rate environment, that creates an extremely low volatility for the foreign exchange market by definition, because people trade the interest rate differential in the foreign exchange market. So for that kind of market, I understand why the volatility is low, and most likely so for the foreseeable future, that will continue to be low volatility.
Let's have a lady right up here. Is there another question on this side of the room I can get? The gentleman right there in the tan suit.
Thank you. Aaliyah Green, Morgan Stanley. I wanted to give the chief risk officers the chance to do what they like to do, which is look at the downside. And then potentially from the journalistic perspective, you can maybe be a little less politically correct about the answer. But we have these conflicting forces of, like you
Morgan
said.
Stanley people cannot ask me the question because I'm going to have a town hall in 2 days.
Okay. That memo didn't go out clearly, Keishi.
Just to save time.
Okay, so then fine, because with an insurance bent. But we have these conflicting forces, right, in terms of the complacency that we have, but all of these urgent sort of changes in terms of negative risks like climate change. You have things that'll drive more and more increased immigration, but increases in populism and sort of nationalism and things where people are moving in ways that go against. So if all of these sort of conflicting things mean that we don't move fast enough and we don't sort of get to these systemic and structural issues that we're talking about, whether it's climate or the economy or whatever, what's worst case scenario?
Okay, right over here.
Thanks. I'm Tim Kubarj from Hardig Levner. I was wondering, many of you have mentioned declining levels of volatility and lots of liquidity in the market. If we're all trying to create diversified portfolios that mitigate the potential to future risks, the other absent thing is the covariance between different assets and the idea that you could protect yourself by dodging in one safe haven when another thing is bobbing the other way. If in this like melt-up situation, assets perform in line with each other, how do you think about promoting more diversification when traditional metrics of risk management are failing?
So why don't we start with you guys on the kind of worst case downside, and then I'll have you take that last one if that makes sense, because he's not from Morgan Stanley.
No. And he wants to talk about covariance.
Yeah, I figured you can't avoid that.
Yeah.
Look, I think, rather than saying what's the ultimate downside, I think the important thing to think about is when you're thinking about those scenarios, right? And and Keishi, you should jump in here. But when you're thinking about those as a risk officer, and when you're designing what's going to happen in that, you want that scenario to be comprehensive. You want to bring in all of the different aspects that you mentioned, but you want to bring them in and say, how do they impact one another, right? Not just, don't throw, everything and the kitchen sink in there, but how do they actually interact with one another? And at what point is it plausible, or when does it become implausible, right? And for then, when it's the doomsday scenario, then, do you really care if you're standing? Does it really matter if you're the last man standing, if there's nobody standing around you, right? But what you want is to really think really hard through the scenario where you don't want to be, the first to fall or in the beginning, and you want to be able to last just that little bit longer as things begin to rebound, et cetera, right? And so you want to be thinking about, given all of those various aspects that you mentioned, which are the most impactful and which potentially drive the others, right? And then what are those interactions? And then think about how does that impact the world? And then how does that impact your company, as a result, and what those impacts are. So rather than predict what's really going to happen, that's one, just to share a little bit of thought around what might go through a risk officer's mind.
Worst case scenario?
Worst case scenario is war. And or apocalyptic, terrible climate change, breakdown of, cyberspace, things like that. I've had a slightly different view of the world for a long time because I did my PhD. I was a cultural anthropologist before I became a journalist, and I worked in a place called Tajikistan, which I shouldn't think many people in the room have been to. And I worked there in the last 2 years of the Soviet Union. And my PhD topic was actually looking at sort of the way that the Islamic identity had survived under the Soviet system in a Tajik village. So my entire academic research was predicated on the Soviet Union being there. And as an anthropologist, I studied the present. And everyone I spoke to, all the academics assumed the Soviet Union was there and was going to be there forever. And literally the month after I finished my on-the-ground fieldwork, the Soviet Union collapsed. And my PhD became history, not anthropology. And then what happened was even worse, because the society I'd lived in was pretty stable when I was there, and very safe. And within a year, it had descended into a very brutal civil war, which was, completely ignored by the outside world, but on a scale in parts of what happened in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And the village, the community I lived with, was caught up in it. And there was a lot of killing, and a lot of very bad things happened. And a society that I thought was totally stable, and I couldn't imagine war happening, became plunged into it. So with that background, I always think, we should never forget how lucky we are to live such incredibly stable lives. The fact that most of us have spent our entire world assuming it's entirely normal to plan for 30 years, or try and price out financial instruments for 100 years sometimes, unless they're from Argentina, is an extraordinary luxury, and we should never take it for granted. And the tragedy is that too many of us do.
Going from that to covariance seems like a little bit of
this was such a great story. I don't even remember the question anymore.
Diversification, covariance, yeah, you really
No,
but I'll just say on that point, anyone here who's come from the former Soviet Union? Yeah. Anyone who has a family history of that knows that unimaginable things can happen, and systems which seem stable. And there's almost like a sort of DNA embedded in your mind, where people who've grown up in America or the West just don't get it.
You talked about the former Soviet Union, where I spent some time in Kazakhstan, but also we're sitting here at the Japan Society, that in some ways is a legacy of that, where a lot of the greatest generation, you talked about Paul Volcker.
Yeah, can I say one other thing about Japan? When I was a journalist in Tokyo, I used to go to the Bank of Japan a lot, and particularly during the financial crisis. I'll never forget at one time being taken down the corridor in the Bank of Japan and seeing portraits, and this very wonderful, very erudite, thoughtful group of officials pointed them out to me, and then pointed out, and these ones were assassinated between the wars. And if you want to understand why Japanese financial figures prize stability above all else, it's because, unlike America, they've seen what happens when financial policies and monetary policies spin out of control along nationalism. You know, what happened between the wars in Japan with the financial mandarins and people who were killed is very, very significant. It shapes policy today. It's like Germany. Why is Bundesbank so terrified of inflation? Because they have folk memories of hyperinflation. The tragedy of America today is there simply aren't enough people in power who have folk memories of the worst case scenario playing out. And the UK, I argue as well.
The son of a pastor, the only thing I can say to that is amen.
I'm sorry.
Do you want to at least take a quick...
Covariance.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, all I can
Sorry, I
say...
didn't mean to talk so much.
No, it's fine. All I can say is that it's an awkward thing for me to say as a risk officer, but diversification only works to a certain extent, and I don't really believe too much on the sort of quantitative analysis for the diversification, particularly in light of all the topics we have talked about. So, you know, even for climate risk or cyber risk management, and there are a lot of things that we cannot quantify to manage risk. So I have a strong belief that we need to overlay a lot of quantitative and model analysis with a lot of judgment and stress testing scenario because, you know, simply we have never experienced that before. Going back to the portfolio sort of, you know, investment analysis, a simple answer is, you know, asking the wrong guy to recommend what kind of portfolio I'll construct, because if I have a good idea, I'm not doing the risk officer, I'll be running a hedge fund. I am conservative as a risk officer, and when we talk about all these liquidity issues and so forth, I worry about, you know, the downside. But the irony is, if I really believe on this liquidity and how the central banks can provide the liquidity in the bad days, I'll buy a lot of risky stuff. And in fact, you know, in my portfolio, I'm still buying a lot of credit paper. I'm looking at a lot of mezzanine paper with certain types of risk, but I don't buy hugely volatile equity. I don't like the technology sector anymore. So if you look at the whole landscape, it's not a question about diversification, but it's a question about where the sweet spot of the risk return. And if you think about, you know, from all the way from the cash treasury to the simple equity, and I'm kind of like, you know, focus on the middle range, because I am one of those complacent investors if I think about my own money. So that's the irony. When you think about the whole market, I get more worried about it. And I try to focus on the liquid market papers. But you know, when I actually behave as an investor, I'm doing exactly the same thing as some of the others.
A long-winded way of saying you either buy into the Powell put or else you buy gold.
So I think we have one more round. So I'm going to go up here to the lady who's been patiently waiting, and then I feel like I have to give Fred the last word in terms of the question. So if you'll give her right here, she's got her hand right there. So somehow we're going to get that across the middle if we give Fred. And those of you that still have questions, we are going to have a time for a reception after this, so I hope you'll stay with us and have that conversation. But I want to be respectful of your time. Otherwise, I'd be a really bad president of the Japan Society in terms of time management. Please, ladies first.
Okay, thank you. My name is Yin Ruyu from Morgan Stanley. And my question is not economy related, because we have time how to do this later. Because you don't know how popular the Keishi is in our risk. My question is literally for Japan society. Do you have any tips to share about how to communicate between very different cultures like American and the Japanese? When I just came to the U.S. 17 years ago, I was a little bit surprised about how popular the Japanese culture is in the U.S. You know, American society is the one that rewards the extrovert personality, while in our Eastern Asian culture, we are quiet people. You can tell that I'm the only Asian that raising my hand, because in our tradition, we're waiting for the call from our senior people. And my question is, if Keishi can share his tips, that will be better.
So, why don't we take it offline and you ask the same question at the town hall? So, yeah, for all due respect, yeah, we can
All right,
handle
thank
that.
you.
Yeah, thank you, sorry.
Fred.
I'm Fred Katayama, and I'm not from Morgan Stanley. But a friend of Morgan Stanley's, Keishi, Hotsuki. At a time when Japan is trying to promote itself as being more open, here's the Olympics 2020, under the spotlight finally, and trying to promote foreign investment, and also trying to promote Tokyo as a place to live, trying to promote Japan's financial reforms, especially corporate governance, what risk, or perhaps reputational risk, does this unfolding saga of Carlos Ghosn pose for Japan, and what is your evaluation on how Japan has responded?
I feel like I'm gonna have to jump on both of these to
Yeah.
make sure I start so that everybody looks at that. So I will take the bait on what lessons learned, because I do think it's important, particularly as someone who grew up overseas, right? As someone who grew up as an American in Japan, I don't think you can find two cultures that may be more far apart. I mean, geographically we're far apart, historically, but there's so many things. To be American in some ways means to be individualistic, to be loud, to be obnoxious sometimes. That's just kind of part of, like, you get rewarded in America for being that startup guy and coming up with a thing. In Japan, as you already pointed out in the Asian context, you get punished, right? The nail that sticks out gets hammered down. But I actually think what's beautiful about that is not that the American way or the Japanese way is better. It's like actually together in that beautiful harmony that Reiwa represents, you find the best of both worlds. And I hope that that's what we try to do here. I think one of the challenges we have is, particularly as a white guy, it's easy for me to say this. I'm from the South. White privilege is a real thing. And I think particularly growing up in Japan, it's easy for me to talk about how great it is to feel like a foreigner, but clearly I was treated a little bit differently, particularly as a white guy who speaks Japanese in a part of Japan that no one speaks English, right? And I think the challenge that we have is to remember a lot of the things that we talked about on this panel and where we've come from, and to understand that my grandfathers fought in World War II. One dropped bombs out of B-29, the other one was part of MacArthur's force that came in on the ground, to see where they came from, to then my missionaries' parents, who literally were trying to save the very people my grandparents were trying to kill, and then to think about my legacy of being here at an organization that's 112, 113 years old, where John D. Rockefeller, Henry Taft, other of these great luminaries have come and gone because they believed in that relationship. Which brings me to Fred's very provocative point, which I'm glad that we're going to end on this note, while all the Japanese in the room collectively took a gasp when you asked that question. This is where in some ways we take a page out of the American playbook, right? I don't think the American president believes any opportunity to talk about yourself is a bad one. I think the Japanese, in this particular case of Carlos Ghosn, have kind of walked right into a trap. The thing that they are weakest at. PR is not a strong Japanese cultural trait, as Gillian has already talked about, in terms of the way that the promoting themselves. It's just not part of the culture. Bragging is not a good thing. Now, as someone who worked on the Middle East and areas near Lebanon and Brazil, I would say that they're fairly opposite, the way you talk about things, kind of braggadocious. So for me, I'm very conflicted by this because I don't like what Carlos Ghosn has done to escape justice. But at the same time, I wish he had stayed and had kind of made a point in Japan. The way he was being treated from the outside perspective looks unfair. And I think particularly when you read the Wall Street Journal and a lot of the other papers out there, they've been overly harsh, overly critical, and there's reasons for that. Because of the points you made, Japan tends to be kind of brushed in a very good light most of the time. Normally when Japan comes out, it's not like countries like Turkey that I spend a lot of time focusing on that get a lot of attention for all the wrong reasons. One of the reasons Japan doesn't end up in the headlines is because it sometimes can be boring. Things work fairly well. You don't have the same societal strife. And so I think what Carlos Ghosn has done is shown a particularly unfavorable light in an area that I think most Japanese, if you take them out to drinks, would say, yeah, there's certain issues here that we all know. And maybe what he was doing in some ways, other people were doing too. And what he did was not necessarily all that wrong in the Japanese business context. It's the fact that he didn't admit to it, right? If he had simply just admitted when the prosecutors pulled him over and said, hey, we need to slap you on the wrist for this, and he basically kind of responded in a way you could have predicted if you worked on the Middle East and got defiant and dug in and entrenched. And the thing that makes me a little sad is this is not just about Carlos Ghosn, right? There's an American who's there as well, Greg Kelly and others, that I think are really going to pay a much higher price because they didn't have the resources to escape. And I hope that, I'm an eternal optimist by nature. And I would hope that even the emotions of the Japanese people right now, where their pride has been hurt, right? You don't just get to escape justice. That's not fair. No Japanese ever would do this. It's not acceptable. It's not allowed. But he's done it. Now there needs to be a price to be paid. The question is, who's going to pay that price? It's always a difficult conversation to have, and I think one of the ones that we hopefully will have more conversations about these difficult issues so that we're able to learn from that. I'll ask if the panelists want to jump in here in particular on any of these issues, but also not force them either in terms of...
Any of you like to comment on Carlos Ghosn?
What is it? I haven't seen the Financial Times. I've seen the Wall Street Journal and New York Times a lot, but where's the Financial Times on this? I don't think I've actually seen a...
Well, we had an exclusive interview with Carlos Ghosn a few days ago.
Oh, really? Okay.
Oh, yeah. I mean, for me, it's a very sad story in many ways because many years ago I wrote a book about change and reform in the Japanese business system, and I focused on the story of Shinsei Bank, Chogin, and the way that essentially, a Japanese bank had collapsed, a foreign team had come in, American team had come in, tried to change it, and then someone who was sort of half Japanese, half American, and then been left in charge trying to pursue reform. And when I wrote the book, the example that hung over me all the time was Carlos Ghosn and Nissan, because it was held up as a rare case where a foreigner had broken into the Japanese corporate world, had shaken it up, delivered good financial results, and essentially paved the way for a spirit of openness, reform, and, if you like, a blending and fusing of the different business traditions and cultures. And what's happened in the last 18 months has shattered that in a way that's very sad indeed. Carlos Ghosn does not emerge well from the stories of what's happened inside Nissan, but the Japanese judicial system does not emerge well at all. I mean, quite the contrary. And it's extremely, extremely sad in every sense. Very sad indeed. I would very much hope that there can be some reflection inside Japan about what's happened, not just about the weaknesses in the judicial system, and I'm not in any way, shape or form condoning what Carlos Ghosn did, but also about the way that someone was left into the system for a while as a black ship, and then essentially the system then turned on him in many ways, inside the company as well, inside Nissan. The message to the outside world at Davos, where it was talked about a lot, has been absolutely terrible. One of the sad things is that all the PR, all the positive PR, and come to Japan messages that the government of Abe have tried to proclaim to the business community have been set back very severely by what's happened.
So I don't want to end on a pessimistic note, so I need to at least put a footnote there that obviously I think the one good thing we all can talk about is that given that we know the Japanese culture and Japan does not do PR particularly well, and sometimes the kind of otonashi or kind of tight-lipped nature of Japanese society when you confront problems like this is actually a one that I think that Americans can actually be very helpful on, and having that dialogue and kind of bringing those conversations that are currently happening in quiet conversations, because nobody really wants to offend somebody else, and the idea of sontaku or kind of self-censorship is the driving force. It's something that we should all think about, and it's something that we can all learn from, and something that I hope we have many more conversations. I want to thank our panelists for having a fascinating and a great conversation about what lies ahead. If you'll join me. Thank you.